As usual, this is MOS 3330, Operations Management, and today we're going to be talking about process improvement. I'm Professor Felipe Rodriguez from the School of Management, Economics, and Mathematics from King's University College at Western University, Canada. So, process improvement in this lesson is based on two book chapters that come from our syllabus. So the very first one is chapter 4 from Cachon, Operations Management, second edition. Really good book, very focused in process process improvement and operations management. Strongly recommend. And then also chapter 8 from Jacobs. It's a little bit more comprehensive. There's a little bit more technique, particularly in the following video where I'm gonna show a deeper example of assembly line balancing, which Cachon doesn't focus as deeply, but we will leave that for the second video. So make sure you read up on chapter 4 from Cachon and chapter 8 from Jacobs and Chase, and we should be good to go. So our learning objectives today, the very first one is the idea that operations is linked to finance. It's linked to cash flows in a company, and I would say this pretty much every single class. Cash is king, and operations management is basically management of cost of goods sold and cost of services. So in another way of saying this is that we need to know what the cost of labor, our variable costs are, our fixed costs are. We have to understand the importance of the labor content in your process and in your cash flow. And we need to understand also our labor utilization, so as to figure out if we're being able to match our supply with our demand. The second objective is to compute what we call takt time. So this is a very, very important concept that we'll be seeing today that relates to a great extent to pooling processes and demand-focused operations, and lean operations and modern manufacturing and just-in-time, and several other techniques that are less worried about pushing inventory through and pushing working process through a operations, and more about pooling goods and services from an operation based on demand. We will also see how this translates to target manpower, meaning what should be your technology and what should be your setup, your process setup, so you're able to fulfill your demand. Then we're going to be talking a little bit more about bottlenecks, which we saw to a great extent in the previous lesson. We will learn how to balance a process, focusing in the demand-driven processes and takt time, basically. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the trade-offs that there exist between a highly specialized process and a more general process. So what is behind the idea of chopping down our process into the smallest of tasks and grouping them together in a very efficient way, and what are the gains to be had from such an approach, and what are the consequences and the negative consequences of that approach. And then in this lesson we will talk a lot about the linkage between operations and finance, and I hope you see that a operations manager in a lot of ways is a person dedicated to COGS reduction, as well as a person, a manager that is focused on cash flow. After all, we're talking about flow of processes and goods and inventory and customers, so it makes sense that we can tie this up with finance. So the list keeps growing as we move along this course, but there are a few things that we need to keep within our mind. First and foremost, we need to match supply and demand. Those two things need to be aligned, okay? And very importantly, when we match supply and demand from the perspective of the operations manager, this not only relates to profits, but also how sustainable our operations are, and we're taking care of people within our organization and around our community. So this the three P's approach is very important from the supply side, and we need to make those two things aligned. Also, very important is more broadly, companies, firms in general, they tend to follow two kinds of general strategies, give or take. So one is cost leadership, and the other one is differentiation. And keep in mind that a cost leadership process is very focused on making it as cheap as possible, and often this has to do with large scale. While differentiation tends to be a lower scale, but most importantly, the idea of creating value to your customer, right? So a operation based on cost leadership, it will tend to run on large batches and have is based in economies of scale, and it tends to be a highly um, automated, low skilled labor, a pushing make to stock kind of technology. While in a differentiation, we try to get a different approach where we're adding value to the customer by creating customized products, and we're going to start pooling products and services from our operation. So it is demand triggered as opposed to supply triggered. So we would talk a lot about more about those things. You got to figure out what kind of strategy you're following, and then therefore you need to set up your operations in different ways to align with your strategy. Third thing is you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So measurement is an integral part of decision making. That is very important. Decision making and measurement are tied together. You need good metrics, you need good performance indicators to be able to make sound decisions, particularly in operations management. Okay. And to that note, when we're dealing with operations, a manager must pay attention to the process triangle, the idea of inventory, capacity, and variability. So these three things are linked into the process triangle, like we've seen before. But most importantly, this is Little's law. Inventory equals flow rate times flow time. So you generate inventory if there is some kind of misalignment between what your flow rate is, which oftentimes is your demand, and your flow time, which is how efficient your process is running through, how fast your process is, right? And if there is a misalignment, inventory becomes waste, capacity becomes unbalanced utilization, and variability becomes excess variability. Those three things should be avoided at all costs. And anytime a operations manager finds one of these, either waste, unbalanced processes, and excess variability, there needs to be a process improvement action of some sort. So oftentimes this is done continuously. So the idea of continuous improvement is key in any kind of operations. There's always a better way to do things. And we should think about this in terms of a better way that adds value to our client. So this is demand triggered. Focus here is on demand. Let's look outside the firm. Let's look outside of our company, outside of our operations. What is it that our clients or our customers want? And then we plan our process according to that. And in terms of continuous improvement, like I said before, you can have PDCA cycles, you can have DMake cycles. The idea is you're constantly trying to upgrade your process, either by technology, either by refining your tasks and your setup, your layout, your workflow. There always is a need for continuous improvement. And last but not least, operations and finance are linked intimately. So if you look at the statement of earnings, the top line in incentive of earnings is sales. Sales is nothing more than a demand realized in a certain time period. So units per month or units per quarter or whatever it is that you have in terms of sales, that represents your flow rate. And then you go to cost of goods sold, which is the line immediately below in your statement of earnings. What is it that is inside cost of goods sold? Well, you have inventory. That could be either working process inventory, raw material inventory, or finished goods inventory. You have a transformation technology in the form of overhead, manufacturing overhead, for example, and you also have direct labor costs. So these three things basically represent the other parts of Little's law: inventory and flow time. So for lack of a better word, uh, you should always think of Little's law as this is your statement of earnings, right? And the lower your inventory is and the faster your flow time is, inevitably you will have a higher gross margin. You have a more efficient operations. So measures of process efficiency, let's define efficiency from an operational perspective as obtaining high input at the lowest cost possible, right? So limited resources, those resources being labor, capital, investment, whatever machinery, whatever it is that you have. So the least amount of resources generating the highest output possible. So if you go back to Porter's value chain, observe what we're talking about here, and see again if you can make that connection with finance. Inbound logistics, this is procurement, this is acquiring inventory from your suppliers. Your operations, this is your process, right? Outbound logistics, this is delivery. So these things are directly linked to operations. They are directly linked to COGS, right? So the smaller you can make these three parts, the more likely it is that you will generate a higher margin of profit. You will create more value to your client. So efficiency is key to generating value. Efficiency is key to generating a positive cash flow, right? But it should not be um, the only dimension of operational performance. You should always think that efficiency is one part of your business. There are more parts of your business that you should be concerned about, particularly the idea of the three Ps: people, profit, and planet. So high efficiency minimizes cost, which increases gross margin and hopefully your profit. But then you should always consider about the people inside your operations, that you're providing the best possible work environment for them. And you should always think about having the most sustainable process in your company. So efficiency is by no means the single operational performance, should not be your single goal. There you go. So profit maximization. Okay, I was talking about finance and operations, and I keep saying, there you go, you have top line sales, then you have COGS, then you have gross margin. So hopefully that will enable you all the way down to your statement of earnings to generate profit. So is profit the primary goal for most operations? Well, nowadays we should think about people, we should think about profit, and we should think about planet, right? So profit maximization is one aspect of a socially responsible operation. So focusing on profit a little bit now, profit is your flow rate times your average price minus your average cost. So how is it that I put flow rate over here? What is really going on? Well, flow rate, this is your demand. This is demand, units per time. And you might want to think about these units in terms of a dollar value. Your average price, this is the value offer to your client. And your average cost, this is obviously how efficient your operation is running. So this is another way of saying that your profit is linked to demand, but not only that, but also the amount of value you're generating and how efficient your operation is. So profit maximization, it is the financial objective of a organization. Um, and it is aiming to maximize the difference between revenue and costs. So value and efficiency. So improving the efficiency of a process. So how is it that we can, for lack of other word, how is it that we can improve our COGS, right? So we can develop measures of efficiency. What you cannot manage, you can't measure, like I said before. But there are more practical ways of looking into efficiency of a process. The very first one is, do you have the right number of steps in your process? Do you have the right number of resources or work centers to meet your demand? That is a key question. Then you should be able to find bottlenecks. And whenever you do find bottlenecks, see if you can increase the capacity of that bottleneck somehow, either by acquiring better technology, by making it faster, by having um, more workers assigned to the bottleneck. So increasing capacity will help increase your flow if that is what you need to match your demand. Another way that you can improve your process is by equalizing the distribution of work, meaning um, most steps along your process should be roughly at around the same utilization rate. That is a key. Now, another way that we should think about in terms of efficiency is providing specialization. The more specialized a series of tasks are, the more specialized is the resource or the machinery or the workers. The faster they become, the cheaper they become relative to the overall cost. So the cost per unit decreases with specialization. So think about Taylor working on a business suit compared to assembly line where individual tasks are done separately and workers do not by any means required to be highly skilled labor. They don't need to be such high skilled as to be able to provide and manufacture an entire business suit. All they need to know is how to execute smaller set of tasks in general, right? So evaluate improvement opportunities. There is always a little bit of improvement to be gained. if you're doing small incremental steps, right? So you can specialize by searching for technology, for example, but you can also try to find small efficiency improvements by, for example, continuous improvement methodologies like Six Sigma, like total quality management and whatnot. So what I would like to say also about this is that managing an operation efficiently is a very valuable skill. Not only in Canada and North America, but worldwide, there is a lack of professionals that can work with process improvement, with value-added process mapping, with um, quality management, with lean operations, with theory of constraints. So um, that skill is rare, and because it's rare, it's paid really well. All right. So final thing that I like to say about improving process and finding efficiencies is that if you can measure your process, you can start thinking in terms of cause and effect. So let's introduce that idea. If X happens, then Y happens. So if I can measure the cause and the effect, I can start thinking in terms of developing experiments. I can start thinking in terms of working with the scientific method to improve my process, right? So, for example, if my absenteeism, if my employees don't show up to work too much, if that increases, what is going to happen to my capacity? You'll likely decrease your production capacity, right? So you can only come up with hypotheses and with alternatives for decision if you're able to measure those two variables. So introducing cause and effect relationships will be a key skill for the operations manager. So let's see. Efficiency is a process is efficient if it can achieve a high flow rate with few resources. I talked about that already. The cost of direct labor is associated with serving one customer or one flow unit. Okay, so let's think about this as a flow unit, which is the total wages paid per unit of time divided by the flow rate. So the cost of direct labor, it's how much you pay your workers per unit of time divided by your demand. So flow rate, remember, this should be your demand. Okay? Now, why is this important? The cost of direct labor in manufacturing, this is COGS. Okay, so calculating, it's part of COGS. So calculating the cost of direct labor enables you to see what is the impact of direct labor in your cost of goods sold, therefore the impact in your gross margin overall. So another important thing, if you look into this little equation over here, as you increase flow rate, if this goes up, the cost of direct labor, what will happen to the cost of direct labor? This will go down, right? So this is a key insight that we must have as operations managers. Fast flow rates or high capacity flow rates, a high flow rate reduces the cost of labor. That is the key, right? So the more output we can have within a process, the lower the unitary cost of labor you will have. So if we're talking about labor, we should think in terms of labor constraints and the content of labor within the value-adding activity of your process. So think about the labor content as the amount of work that goes into serving one customer or one flow unit. This is the sum of the processing times involving labor. So if I have a process with 2 or 3 stages, so I'm summing up the processing times of all these guys, okay? Plus the idle times that go with them. But the idea is I need to find some kind of a sum of all the tasks, all the time taken to perform every single task to process your goods or your services. So this is a ratio of input to output, okay? So labor content, sum it up, all the tasks required to produce a certain good or provide a certain service. And the average labor utilization will be necessarily linked to your labor content. So the sum of all your tasks divided by how many people are working there, your resources, your work centers, the number of work centers, right? And we will see over here, let me call this a beat for now on. So this should be your cycle time, right? Or even better, a takt time. We're going to be seeing that in the next slide. So average labor utilization is an important measurement because obviously you want to be able to have a high labor utilization. People are busy. You're paying them to provide output, right? So you want a high labor utilization, but you don't want to be too high because you won't be able to absorb variation in demand. So if you remember from the process triangle, you have utilization capacity, you have variability, and you have inventory. If there is variations in demand, for example, those other two factors will also change. So you want to be able to absorb certain variations. So you can't be running at 100% utilization. You're going to burn out your employees, your machines will break. You want to have a little bit of room because you need to do maintenance, you need to treat your workers well, you need to provide breaks. Not only that, but then also you need to be able to absorb demand if demand increases. So, as I was talking before, a key measurement within efficiency is the amount of idle time that you're generating within your process. So idle time is key because ultimately idle time means no value added. So for example, if you are in a blood donation clinic, any kind of weight that you have at the blood donation clinic is contributing absolutely nothing to the outcome of that process, which is the donated blood. And you can go on and on about this. For example, in a drive-through, any wait in a drive-through is idle time. There's also setup times that are incredibly expensive and add absolutely no value to your operation. So an efficient process should have as little idle time as possible, as long as you're maintaining enough time to provide breaks and maintenance and setups to your organization, right? Idle time is no value added. So one way of thinking in terms of idle time is the amount of time a flow unit spends with no value added, right? Or the amount of time per flow unit added up across all the resources. For every customer we serve, we incur and pay for idle time. right? So if we evaluate the cost of idle time, we should be able to compare that with the amount of labor content. So what is the ratio between those two? Laborers get paid while they're working and while they're idle. So we want to be able to track how much idle time we have in a process, because that is ultimately seen as either a buffer for an increase in demand, if you're able to, or um, wasted cash in the form of extra wages that are not adding value to your process. Okay. Another way that we can think in terms of total idle time is, what if we can match that with efficiency, right? So, for example, you can think in terms of overall efficiency. Sometimes people call this OEE. There are different measurements that you can go about this: overall equipment efficiency, overall process efficiency, or efficiency in general. Should be seen as the labor content that you have in a process divided by the amount of resources. Let me call these work centers or workers that you have in a process, or stages that you have in a process. All of that times your cycle time. So that little equation shows these are very similar. They're tracking roughly the same thing, right? It's just how you want to interpret this. Do you want to go about the total idle time, or do you want to see the amount of resources that you're engaging in your process and how well they're being utilized, how efficient those resources are being? So if the labor content is labor content is really high, you can see that the numerator goes up, so your efficiency goes up, right? On the other hand, if your cycle time is really long, your efficiency is going to fall, right? This is going to fall. Or the other way around too. If you have lots and lots of work centers, your process is divided into a very, very small number of tasks that will increase the overall efficiency of your process. So these two things are linked together, and we're going to be seeing this when we talk about assembly line balancing. So let's start thinking about, okay, so that's how we measure efficiency. Now let's start to do some process improvement. So how to choose a staffing level, or how to choose the amount of resources that we need to match with our demand. So matching supply and demand almost always starts with taking the demand rate as given, and then you work your way backwards, attempting to staff or provide resources in order to meet that demand. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because there is a difference when you think in terms of demand versus supply. Demand triggered versus supply triggered. What I'm talking in here is a lot related to what we call pooling demand from within our process, as opposed to pushing inventory within our process. Those are completely different ways of seeing operations. And the demand driven, the pool kind of process, oftentimes this is what we call make to order, and from this other side, make to stock. From one end, these people are looking outwards into the market and adapting to the market, as opposed to the supply based demand that is looking inwards. What is it that I can do? And then trying to provide that to the market. Inevitably, a push process, a make to stock process, as in the name itself says, tends to have higher inventory. And higher inventory leads to higher COGS, which on the other hand leads to lower margins. Also leads to lower cash and worse cash flow. So ultimately, by looking to the demand and then adjusting to the demand, we're reducing inventory and then we're reducing COGS. So very important to think about this is that idea of operational fit. So you have on the x-axis your volume, and on the y-axis the degree of standardization within your process. So very unique processes. We usually call them project. They have a timestamp. They have um, an expiry date, if you want to call it so. Or on the other way, you have continuous flow and line flow, long assembly lines, high volume with low differentiation. So what I would like to focus right now is the idea that it could be customer triggered versus anticipating demand. Anticipating demand, this means inventory, while customer trigger means make to order, or as close to make to order as you can, right? And if you can do that, you can therefore attempt to create value by providing customized products and services to your client. So in a lot of ways, by looking into these parameters and trying to place those higher up in the flow of your operation, right? So why we usually have this divide where these things here are very tailor-made, low quantity and whatnot, and from this side up you have high quantities um, and very standardized products. Wait a second, what if we can look into our demand and adjust our process to our demand? Okay, so remember about this: make to order, pull, lean. These are all terms that we're trying to push towards higher volume with the deal of generating value to your client, with the idea of being demand driven as opposed to supply driven. We don't want to push inventory and wait for demand to realize. We want to realize demand and only then spend cash to fulfill our demand. So ultimately, our process is linked to better cash flow because you're not having working process inventory, you don't have finished goods inventory waiting for demand to materialize, right? So here, what we're looking in terms of cash is accounts receivable versus accounts payable. Your accounts payable go up if your inventory goes up, right? And if you don't sell anything, your accounts receivable is low. So what you want to do is have accounts receivable going up and accounts payable going down, meaning less inventory throughout your supply in your operation, and therefore you will try to be as make to order as you can. So the operational fit that I'm talking about here is basically taking the idea of a demand-driven process regardless of where you are in the process flow. And we can do this with a very simple trick called takt time. Takt time, also known as the beat or the rhythm or the pace of your demand. Okay, so that's the ratio between the time available and the quantity that has to be produced to serve demand. So how much time I have production time divided by your demand per day. So observe, sorry, observe the production time can be seen, for example, as seconds or hours in a day, and demand can be seen as units in a day. So in the end, takt time will be a measurement of time per units. So this is always time per unit. We have another measurement that is also related to time per unit. That is called cycle time. And we'll be talking about cycle time in a little while, right? So it is measured, driven by demand. The goal is to design a process that meets the demand rate. So if I need, for example, one car per minute, if that is my demand for my car wash, for example, I should staff and provide a process to my clients that enables me to process one car per minute. Okay, that is very similar to cycle time, but it's demand driven. It is the demand that tells you what pace you should run your operation. So process should not operate at the discretionary flow of resources. That is a key component of takt time. We do not want to run an operation at the fastest pace possible without demand to realize that operation. So you don't push raw materials and transform them into a working process inventory and then transform them into finished goods without having demand for your products. What you want to do is the other way around. You want to know what the demand is and then have a process that is fast enough to or close enough to meet that demand. So takt time is the available time. Again, this is, for example, seconds per day by the required quantity, which is your demand measured in units per day. So in the end, you finish with seconds per unit, okay? Very key that we take those two. So takt time, in another way of seeing that, is 1 divided by the demand rate. So a rate is units per time, while takt time is time per unit, okay? Similarly to cycle time, which is a flow rate of units per time, and cycle time is time per unit, okay? So takt time is the demand rate, is 1 divided by the demand rate. It does not depend on process capacity. That is what the market expects from you. This is exogenous to your company, right? While cycle time may depend on your process capacity. Sometimes you are demand constrained, other times you're capacity constrained. So you have to be able to understand when those two things come into play. So if you're going to be matching supply with demand, the goal is to have your cycle time, meaning you are setting up your capacity and your process to be as close to the takt time as possible. Okay? Now remember this, that you should not want to be busy. You don't want your capacity, you don't want to be running at full capacity and creating inventory just because you can, right? Remember about this. This is COGS, inventory. So if you run your operation at your full capacity, you are increasing COGS and therefore decreasing your margin. So you shouldn't be running at full steam. what you should do is find your demand and work at the pace that your demand requires. 1 car per minute, 1 sandwich per minute, or 2 patients per, sorry, so 1 patient every half an hour, or 1 call every 30 seconds, right? So that's the way that you should be thinking about. So how do we do that? How do we choose the staffing level to match our demand? Well, first and foremost, you should find your target resource. How many employees you need, how many machines you need, how much manpower do you require to run a certain amount of tasks in your process. So that's the ratio. The target manpower is the ratio between the labor content and the takt time. So remember, labor content is the sum of all your task times, and your takt time is based on your demand rate, right? So this is 1 divided by your demand. So in other words, we should be thinking about this little equation in terms of how can I extract some intuition from this, right? So if there is a lot of tasks, if I have a lot of labor content, ultimately, I will need a lot of manpower to run this process, right? On the other hand, let me use a different color over here. If if I have high demand, what does that do with takt time? A high demand means I have a very short takt time. So if this is small, what happens to my target manpower? Anything divided by a small number becomes a big number, right? So what we're thinking over here is that the higher your demand, the more manpower you need, the more resources you need. So this could be employees, this could be machines, this could be work centers, right? So very much demand driven. More demand means a shorter takt time. Shorter takt time requires more employees to handle the same amount of labor content. So let's see how these things play out. So let's see, staffing process improvement. In most businesses, what we have today is that demand varies over time, right? So you need to be prepared to level the demand when that demand realizes. So look at this little graph here to the right, where on the x-axis I have time passing by, right? And on the y-axis I have volume of sales. So if you're running an operation, any kind of operation, this could be car sales, this could be umbrella sales, this could be credit card sales, this could be Christmas trees, this could be vacations, this could be hotel rooms, doesn't really matter. You will oftentimes find seasonality. Right, Christmas tree is a good example. Ice cream would be another one. Travel could be another one. Right, flu season could create different kinds of demands for hospital beds or for medicines and whatnot. There could be product life cycles, and among other things, right? So demand varies over time. So what you don't want to do in any way is to level off your demand in the long run. And so if this is your capacity, I will tell you what will happen. Let me use the red ink right now. If you're creating capacity overall, in periods of low demand, all of this difference that you're producing right now is basically inventory that you will get to spend at a later time, right? So building up inventory may seem like a interesting idea as long as it's not for a very long period of time. What that means is inventory carries holding costs. So the more inventory you carry, the higher you will spend just to warehouse and maintain that inventory overall. Not to mention your problem with cash flow. So let me use a different color here to show you from a finance perspective. All of this part here that you produced, this is accounts payable. While on the other hand, here is where you have accounts receivable. So you have an unbalance of cash flow. That could be a big issue with the overall financial health of your organization. So what you want to do is work with leveled demand. So if there's variability in demand, and again, understand that in the process triangle, utilization capacity, variability, and inventory. So the more you have variability, the more inventory will be affected, right? So how is it that we can adjust to this? Well, we can adjust our capacity to level off inventory. So you level demand in different periods of time. Over here, for example, I'm dividing this time frame into 3 periods. So I know this is the average demand for this moment of time. This is for this guy, and this is for this guy. That represents a takt time of a certain pace, for example, 45 seconds or whatever that is, and that represents a certain number of employees or a certain number of resources that I will require to be able to fulfill that demand. Observe the difference. For example, since we're talking about inventory, what's going to happen with inventory over here, and what's happening to inventory over here, and what's happening to inventory over here. This is much smaller than what you would find in the graph immediately above. So you're improving your cash flow. You're also improving the financial health of your organization, but very importantly, you're creating a process that is predictable. You're creating a process that ultimately is stable. And you know what happens? If a stable process, a steady state process, steady state means it's easy to manage. And that's what you want in operations management. You want to be able to focus in process improvement and focusing research and development and other things, as opposed to putting out fires in your operation. So leveling of demand is one aspect. The other one is offloading the bottleneck. So we saw from the previous class how it is that we can find bottlenecks in a process. And then the idea here is that you should be able to find the utilization rate should be roughly the same between all the stages on your process. So you should be running at roughly the same kind of utilization that creates a stable flow, a stable pace. And that's what you want, a cycle time that is predictable overall, and it's closely aligned with each one of the work centers in your process. So let's move on into balancing a process and look into a technique called assembly line balancing. So we reassign activities to other resources with more capacity. In other words, we divide a process into the smallest tasks possible, and you list them up. They have to be in very, very small steps, and you're going to bundle these steps in order and divide that throughout the assembly line so as to match your takt time. That is the idea. So you should, because you can divide in small, the smallest tasks possible, you can therefore spread out your process. And looking back into that equation that we saw before, in terms of target manpower, right? So the lots of task times, labor content will increase your target manpower, but in the other hand, the where did that go? Sorry. Yeah, moving down. But on the other hand, you, by dividing these tasks into smaller chunks, you can spread that out in many workstations and many work centers with many employees, and therefore be closer to the demand rate, be closer to the takt time that you're expecting. How is it that you can do that? Well, first one is you can automate a lot of time-consuming activities. If you can divide activities into very, very small steps. For example, if you're a tailor and you're assembling a business suit, for example, you don't want to have one process called business suit. You want to call, this is button, this is cutting, this is zipper, this is that. Like, you chunk it down to the smallest possible tasks. And if you can do that, you can create machines specialized in executing that very simple task, right? Other things that you can also do is you can outsource some activities. So, for example, um, car makers enjoy this to a great deal. They outsource a lot of activities to their suppliers, so they receive pre-assembled kits, which therefore makes the assembly process into the car assembly line a lot easier, a lot faster, right? And then you might want to consider adding more employees or overtime, depending on how much your demand will vary. So line balancing can be done in different ways. Sometimes you have a fixed sequence of activities. So A has to be followed by B, that has to be followed by C, that has to be followed by D. Other times you have activities that run in parallel. So here you have activity E, E runs into F, and then F feeds into C, right? So you might need to provide workstations that bundle these activities in certain ways, respecting the sequence in which they happen. So you reshuffle these activities around. For example, this work center over here, number 1, has activities A, E, and F. Maybe I want to reshuffle activity F to B and C, and then workstation 1 is only A and E, and that would create a process much more aligned to a takt time, for example. So why is it that we do that? We allow for flexibility, and we balance the resources more efficiently by following takt time. The work centers, I cannot stress this enough, they should be as close to the takt time as possible. So here's a good example: line balancing, takt time, and staffing to demand. Let's assume this is a process that has already been given to you. You have workstation number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is the amount of time each one of these workstations or work centers is performing. You can clearly see by this process over here, if these activities run in tandem, activity 4 would likely be your bottleneck, right? So, but let's investigate that a little further. Let's sum up 19 with 21, with 16, with 33, with 27, and we're going to find that the sum of all of these tasks over here, right? So we're summing all these up. This is equivalent to 116 seconds per unit. Now, if I know what my demand per day is, 670 units per day, and I know my available production time, now I can start thinking in terms of what will be my target manpower that will enable me to run my process according to the pace of demand, right? So let's see how that we go about. So 8-hour shifts, that represents 28,800 seconds per shift, right? And I know what my demand is. So this is my labor content. I'm going to divide that by 670 units. So I know that my takt time is 43 seconds per unit. Every 43 seconds, one customer will place an order for me and I have to deliver. So what is my target manpower? The sum of all those tasks, sum of tasks, divided by my takt. Sometimes we call this the NT, the theoretical minimum number of workstations. In this case, if you divide 116 by 43, you get 2.7 work centers, for example. So we can do that. So you get to round it up to 3. Right? So that is your target manpower. That is your target number of work centers in your process. So instead of having 5 work centers, that is no good. You're going to migrate towards a process that has 3 work centers, and that's how they're working. They are going to be working, all of them at or below the takt time. So you will be able to match your demand to your capacity to supply to that demand. Now, very importantly, this is done in a much more complex manner if you have activities that are not a single flow of activities, you have multiple parallel flows. And I will record a video showing how we solve the multiple flow problem in the assembly line algorithm, okay? So very important. Takt time stands for rhythm, stands for pace. So you have divided your process according to the pace of your demand. Let's get some more examples in. Every 43 minutes, a sandwich must be made to give to a customer. Every 43, in this case, this is seconds, right? Every 43 seconds, a call will come in and you have to process that call, right? So the idea is you're observing the end of this line and you should see one flow unit every 43 seconds. That is the key, okay? So, but by doing so, remember that I mentioned to you, we need to divide those tasks into the smallest steps possible, right? So thinking that from a broader perspective, what you're doing is taking craftsmanship and transforming that into a mechanical, mindless process, right? So the tailor can see the entire suit being assembled. One individual, highly skilled, can assemble an entire business suit. But by dividing that activity into its smallest steps, what you can do is spread these activities out, speeding up your process, and that enables you to buy specialized equipment and to train employees to that single specific task. It's a lot easier to train a person to press a button and a button only than to transform that person into a tailor. Another example that I like to give is it takes years and years and years for a person to learn how to shoot a longbow um, accurately. So, although this is an example from perhaps the Middle Ages and whatnot, and the Renaissance, so it takes anywhere between 5 and 10 years for someone to shoot a longbow with accuracy, but it takes maybe a couple weeks to to learn for a person, an individual, a soldier, to learn how to shoot a rifle. So you're dividing tasks into the smallest steps possible. In the case of a rifle, it's just to press a trigger, right, and aim very differently from a bow in that perspective. We we can have a lot more examples about this. Simple tasks require less skilled, and if it requires less skill, it's easier to learn, right? So it takes years and years to train a chef, but it takes a couple days to learn to teach a person to flip burgers, right? Uh, so specialization increases efficiency from that way. It also eliminates setups, right? Because you have specialized machines and all they do is a single task, right? And you have specialized employees, all they do is a single task. So that increases efficiency a great deal. We're going to be talking a little bit more about setups and batch sizes in the next chapters, so pay attention to that also. The other thing with specialization of labor is that you have economies of scale by learning curves. The more you practice a single task, the better off you will be, right? So a carpenter building an entire piece of furniture uh, requires a lot of skilled labor and would take a lot of time to be able to perfect that piece of furniture. But if you divide the assembly of that piece of furniture into very, very small steps, you can make people specialize in that one single step, and then you'll be able to have a high throughput in that process, and it will keep increasing because people will keep learning and being faster and faster. Practice makes perfect, right? The other part with specialization is that by dividing two small steps and having your process mapped out in such way, designed in such way, you're able to hire low skilled labor, right? This could be good with respect to reducing costs, but it may also be negative if you create a work environment that completely deplete those human beings, your employees, of generating good input and of learning and to be motivated into the workplace, right? So although specialized work tends to require shorter training periods, sometimes it pays lower, it motivates less, right? So think about the machines, sorry, the factories of 20, 30 years ago even, or even some cases that we know of today where employees perform a single task for days and days and days on end. They end up having all sorts of problems with your body. They have low um, they have low motivation to go to work. These people are not contributing with what humans have to offer best, which is the ability to be creative and the ability to improve and be adaptable to different situations, right? The other thing that also happens with specialization is equipment replication, where if you can provide, you need to provide extra equipment for non-specialized labor, and oftentimes resources often leads to a low level of equipment utilization. So you need to replicate lots and lots of equipment just to guarantee that your process flow will run smoothly. And from the other side of that very inhuman, mechanized, almost robotic kind of process flow, from low-skilled, cheap labor performing individual tasks almost mindlessly, you have, for example, layouts such as work cells, where smaller teams of people are responsible for the full range of tasks for a single process, for a single flow unit. And by allowing those cells to generate ideas and to be responsible for the finished product as opposed to be responsible for a single step of the process, you enable those people to create new ideas, to develop a sense of ownership and a sense of empowerment. And that is often done with the idea that you can recruit your workers to improve your process, and you can reward your workers to be part of the continuous improvement of your organization. We will see a little bit more, in fact, a lot more of that when we see Toyota production systems, when we see quality management, and how you can leverage what humans have best, which is creativity and adaptability and the capacity to innovate, and how that can help you improve your process. So finally, I've spoken a little bit about financial impact of process improvements. So again, profits, this is your bottom line. This will be related to your demand. This will be related to your value, and this will be related to to your process flow time. So think about this for a moment. Your average cost is composed of fixed costs. This will happen no matter how much you produce or how many customers you're able to service. And then also your variable costs, right? So wages and inventory and whatnot. So if you look uh, at an operations from a financial perspective, what you're actually seeing is the entire operations composed entirely of COGS and fixed expenses. This tends to be your technology, your investment. This is going to show as amortization, for example, right? While on this side, this will be your inventory, this will be your direct wages in your organization, and this will be your sales. So there's no way that you can detach your operations from finance. And ultimately, as you reduce these guys, you improve your gross margin. So in conclusion, there are quite a few key calculations for efficiency, and there's a whole bunch of process improvement strategies. And I would like to point out that there are linkages to finance, and there is an infinite amount of process improvement and continuous improvement that can be done within your operations. I'm just going to put the make over here. All these kinds of process improvement methodologies that can be done to staff demand, to reduce bottlenecks. Let me put Six Sigma over here, balancing the assembly line, and ultimately deciding on specialization levels. Remember, these things might be operational, but they may also be strategic. Strategy. So operations is the enabler of your strategy. So which one of these approaches are right? You're matching supply with demand based on takt time. So move as close to make to order as you can. Be as close to demand driven as you can. Move to pull process as much as you can. Move to just in time process as much as you can. All of that enables you to reduce your COGS, right? You can also look in terms of increasing capacity at any given bottleneck. And sometimes looking at the demand is enough. Oftentimes it's not a matter of being demand constraint, it's a matter of being capacity constraint. So that will be where you're going to attack your bottleneck, right? And finding the level of specialization will also be a question of what kind of strategy you're going to go. Cost leadership versus differentiation, right? So when we're thinking about which one of these to approach first, obviously, bottlenecks will always be found in any process. It depends on whether it's demand-driven or demand constrained or capacity constrained, but it's the idea of operational fit. How can you fit your process to match your demand, right? So that's what I have for today. I will post another video just with the assembly line balancing exercise with multiple flows and multiple precedence levels in the activities. If you have any question, please let me know, send me an email, and until next lesson. So thank you all very much. I'm gonna stop the recording of the video right now and see you soon.